Hey everyone, and welcome back. Get ready, because
Thanks.
today we're going to be time traveling way back to the ancient world
That's right.
for a deep dive into the history of slavery.
A topic that's as complex as it is fascinating.
Yeah, and as we'll see, it's a history that's way longer and more widespread than many people realize.
Absolutely. Evidence of slavery goes back to prehistory.
Wow, so we're talking even before the Roman Empire.
Long before.
Okay, so no togas or gladiators in this episode.
Not this time.
We're going even further back to the very roots of civilization. So how did slavery even begin? I mean, was it just like a natural progression as societies developed or something a little bit more sinister?
Well, the exact origins are still a bit of a mystery, but it seems very likely that the rise of agriculture and settled communities played a huge role.
Okay, I could see that.
Once you have a surplus of food and resources, you have the potential for wealth accumulation,
Right.
specialization of labor, and you know what happens then?
What?
Social hierarchies. They start to emerge.
So instead of everyone pitching in for survival,
Hmm?
some people start calling the shots.
Exactly. And that's where we see those seeds of exploitation being sown. Suddenly, you have a need for labor to maintain that surplus and those in power. Well, they're looking for ways to, shall we say, incentivize it,
Right.
if you know what I mean.
It's incredible how something seemingly as basic as agriculture could have such profound social consequences. So where do we see the first hard evidence of slavery, like actual written records?
One of the earliest examples comes from ancient Mesopotamia,
Okay.
specifically the Code of Hammurabi.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
This legal code dates back to the 18th century BCE and actually has specific laws regulating slavery.
Really? Like what kind of things?
Everything,
Right.
from how slaves could be bought and sold to punishments for mistreating them.
It was already a system back then.
Oh, yeah. It even outlines punishments for harboring runaway slaves.
Hold on. Runaway slaves in ancient Mesopotamia. That suggests they weren't too happy with their situation.
Of course not. Slavery, no matter the time period, always involves an element of coercion
Right.
and control. And the fact that laws existed to prevent escape tells us that resistance, well, that was a constant reality.
That's a really important point. Slavery wasn't just a passive system. There was always push and pull between those in power and those seeking freedom. Now, we often associate ancient Egypt with grand monuments like the pyramids.
Of course.
Did slavery play a role in those massive projects?
Absolutely. Now, while popular culture might lead you to believe that the pyramids were built by hordes of slaves toiling under the whip, the reality is a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
Yes, slaves were used for labor in ancient Egypt, but they weren't the only ones building those iconic structures.
So there's more to the story than Hollywood would have us believe.
Right.
What did everyday life actually look like for slaves in ancient Egypt?
Well, for starters, slavery wasn't necessarily a lifetime sentence.
Right.
Yeah. Some individuals were enslaved temporarily because of debt or as prisoners of war. They might have worked alongside free laborers on construction projects in agricultural fields or even as domestic servants in wealthy households.
So it sounds like there was a mix of skilled and unskilled labor involved. Did slaves have any rights or protections under Egyptian law?
Yes, actually. Surprisingly, Egyptian law offered certain safeguards for slaves.
Interesting.
For example, masters were forbidden from killing their slaves without justification,
Okay.
and slaves could even petition for their freedom in court.
Wow. So it's not as simple as slave equals no rights in ancient Egypt.
Definitely not. It was much more complex than that.
Now, I know we're focusing on life before the Roman Empire, but I can't help but wonder, did other major civilizations like Greece and Rome have similar systems of slavery?
Well, both Greece and Rome were deeply reliant on slave labor. But their systems were even more extensive and complex than what we've seen so far. We'll delve deeper into Roman slavery in our next episode. But for now, let's explore how slavery manifested in other parts of the ancient world.
Perfect. Because I'm starting to realize that slavery wasn't just a localized phenomenon.
Not at all.
It was happening across continents.
Yeah.
In vastly different cultures. So tell me, what was happening in ancient India and China? Were they using slave labor too?
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see how similar patterns emerge,
Yeah.
even across vast distances.
Okay.
In ancient India, during the Vedic period, slavery was already a well-established institution.
Interesting.
Just like in Mesopotamia and Egypt, war captives, criminals, and debtors could all find themselves enslaved.
So we're seeing the same drivers of slavery across these different civilizations. Warfare, debt, those in power consolidating their control.
Exactly. It seems like those are some of the universal ingredients, no matter the time period or location. But it's important to remember that while there are similarities, there were also unique aspects to slavery in each society.
Okay.
For instance, the Indian caste system, while not directly comparable to slavery, did create a rigid social hierarchy
Right.
with its own forms of bonded labor
Gotcha.
and exploitation.
That's a really interesting point, how systems that weren't explicitly about slavery could still create conditions that mirrored it.
Right.
It makes you think about how power and inequality can take on different forms but still have very similar consequences. So what about ancient China? Did they follow the same playbook?
Well, in ancient China, slavery took on some particularly striking forms.
Okay.
During the Shang Dynasty, for instance, slaves were not only used for labor, but also, and this is a bit unsettling, as human sacrifices.
Wait, human sacrifices, that's a whole other level of brutality.
Yeah.
I always thought that was more of a Mesoamerican thing.
It's definitely a stark contrast to what we've seen in other cultures, but it highlights the fact that even within the broader context of slavery, there were vast differences in how it was practiced and the role slaves played in society.
This is like peeling back layers of history and realizing just how complicated this whole issue of slavery really is. I'm already starting to rethink some of my assumptions. But before we get too lost in the intricacies of China, let's zoom out for a moment and consider the bigger picture. We've been talking about Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China, all these major civilizations relying on slave labor. It's starting to feel like a global phenomenon, not just a European one.
You're absolutely right, and to fully grasp the scope of slavery in the ancient world, we need to venture beyond those familiar empires.
Okay.
It's time to explore a side of history that often gets overlooked: indigenous slavery in the Americas.
Oh,
Did you know that various indigenous groups in North and South America practiced forms of slavery long before European colonizers arrived on the scene?
wait, really?
Yeah.
I always thought slavery in the Americas was a direct result of European colonialism. That's a game changer. So are we talking about similar systems to what we've seen elsewhere, or something entirely different?
Well, just like in the other civilizations we've discussed, there were common threads like war captives being enslaved and people falling into debt bondage. But indigenous slavery also had its own unique characteristics. The treatment of slaves varied widely, with some being integrated into families and communities, while others faced harsher conditions.
Okay, so it's not as simple as saying all indigenous slavery was the same.
No.
It was a complex spectrum of experiences, just like in other parts of the ancient world. This is getting really fascinating, but I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface. We're going to need more time to unpack all this.
You're right, there's so much more to explore, but I think we've laid a good foundation for understanding the widespread nature of slavery in the ancient world. We've seen how it arose in different contexts, driven by factors like warfare, debt, and the desire for power and control. And we've started to appreciate the complexities and variations that existed across different cultures.
It's been mind-blowing, to be honest.
Well,
I'm
yeah.
starting to see history in a whole new light. But for now, we're going to have to take a pause. Join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll journey to another continent, Africa, and uncover the fascinating history of slavery that unfolded there long before European involvement.
It's a story that often gets overshadowed, so I'm excited to shed some light on it and continue our exploration of this complex and often challenging chapter in human history.
Sounds good.
Into the history of slavery in the ancient world. We've just begun to uncover the fascinating and complex tapestry of this practice across different civilizations.
It's amazing to think about all the societies we've explored so far, and how despite vast distances and unique cultures, they all had some form of slavery. It really makes you question that whole notion that it was simply a European invention or a product of one specific time period.
You're absolutely right. Slavery was woven into the fabric of many ancient societies long before the events we typically associate with the term. And as we journey further into this exploration, you'll discover even more nuances and complexities that challenge our preconceived notions.
I'm ready to dive in. Last time we left off talking about indigenous slavery in the Americas, which was a real eye-opener for me. I'm eager to learn more about the specific forms it took and how it compares to what we've seen in other parts of the ancient world.
Well, one of the things that makes indigenous slavery so fascinating is its diversity. Just like the incredible variety of cultures that existed in the Americas before European contact, the forms of slavery practiced by indigenous groups were equally diverse.
So we're not talking about a single monolithic system, but rather a spectrum of practices and experiences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to move beyond generalizations and delve into the specific historical contexts of each group. For instance, among the Haudenosaunee people, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, in what's now the northeastern United States, captives taken during warfare were often adopted into the tribe rather than being subjected to harsh labor.
Wow, that's really interesting. It almost sounds like a form of assimilation rather than the brutal exploitation we often associate with slavery.
It's a great example of how indigenous slavery could be much more nuanced than we might imagine. In this case, integrating captives into the tribe served several purposes. It replenished their population, strengthened their social bonds, and even introduced new skills and knowledge.
Makes sense. I guess from a purely practical standpoint, it was a way to maintain their society's strength and resilience. But were all indigenous groups so welcoming to their captives?
Not necessarily. While some groups practiced forms of adoption or integration, others imposed much stricter conditions on enslaved individuals. For example, among certain Northwest Coast tribes, like the Twinet and Haydada, slaves were considered property and often faced harsh treatment. Their labor was essential for maintaining the economic and social power of the elite within those societies.
So it seems like power dynamics and economic factors played a significant role, just like in the other ancient societies we've discussed. But what about the reasons for enslavement? Were they similar to what we've seen elsewhere?
Yes, in many cases, the reasons for enslavement in the Americas mirrored those found in other parts of the world. Warfare was a primary driver, with captives taken during conflicts often being enslaved by the victorious group. Debt bondage was also common, with individuals falling into servitude to repay debts or as a form of punishment for crimes.
It's fascinating how these patterns repeat themselves across such different cultures and geographical locations. It really highlights the fact that slavery wasn't limited to any one region or civilization.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that human history is filled with both inspiring examples of cooperation and disturbing instances of exploitation. But let's not forget that indigenous slavery also had its own unique characteristics.
Oh, right. I remember you mentioned something about hereditary slavery last time. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, in some indigenous societies, the status of a slave was passed down from one generation to the next, meaning that children born to enslaved parents were automatically considered slaves themselves. This practice ensured a continuous source of labor and reinforced existing social hierarchies.
That's heartbreaking to think about. Imagine being born into a system where your freedom and future are predetermined by your parents' status. It really makes you appreciate the struggles for freedom and equality that have persisted throughout history.
Absolutely. And it's important to acknowledge that while some enslaved individuals may have found ways to improve their circumstances or even gain their freedom, many others lived their entire lives under the control of others.
It's a reminder that we can't romanticize the past or downplay the very real suffering that occurred under these systems of slavery. Now, I know we've been focusing on the Americas, but I'm curious to learn more about what was happening in Africa before European involvement. I have a feeling there's a lot more to uncover there.
You're absolutely right. The history of slavery in Africa is incredibly rich and diverse, and it's essential to understand that it existed long before the transatlantic slave trade.
So we're talking about centuries of history that often get overlooked or overshadowed by later events. I'm ready to dive into this unexplored territory. What can you tell us about the forms of slavery that were present in Africa during this time period?
Well, one of the key things to remember is that Africa is a vast continent with a multitude of cultures, languages, and historical trajectories. So, just like in the Americas, there was no single monolithic form of slavery.
It seems like diversity is a recurring theme when we're talking about ancient slavery.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to approach this topic with nuance and avoid making sweeping generalizations. Now, one form of slavery that was prevalent in many African societies was what we might call household slavery.
Household slavery. What did that look like in practice?
Well, in this system, enslaved individuals were typically integrated into the household of their enslavers, often working as domestic servants, agricultural laborers, or even skilled artisans. The conditions of their enslavement could vary significantly depending on the specific society and the role they played within the household.
So it sounds like there was a potential for a degree of intimacy and even personal relationships to develop between enslavers and the enslaved in this context.
Yes, and that's what makes this form of slavery so complex. While it's crucial to acknowledge the inherent power imbalance and exploitation involved, it's also important to recognize that the lines between enslaver and enslaved could sometimes become blurred.
I can see how that could create a whole other layer of complexity, both in terms of the lived experiences of those involved and in how we interpret those experiences from a historical perspective.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that human relationships, even within systems of oppression, can be messy, complicated, and full of contradictions.
This is all so fascinating, but I'm also realizing just how much more we have to learn about the vast and varied history of slavery in the ancient world.
You're right, we've only just scratched the surface. But I hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the complexities of this topic and a desire to explore it further.
It definitely has.